Hey everyone! Today we're diving into an interesting chapter of history that not everyone knows about, the Bar Kochba Revolt. Now, this wasn't just any rebellion. It was the third and final war between the Jewish people and the mighty Roman Empire, happening between 132 and 136 CE. And trust me, things got intense. So, this all came after years of tension, conflict, and violence. The first big Jewish revolt had happened between 66 and 70 CE, and that one ended with the destruction of the Second Temple, a huge loss for the Jewish people. Then there was the Kitos War around 115 to 117 CE, but what really sets the Bar Kochba Revolt apart from the earlier ones was the fact that, for the first time, the Jewish people were united. They weren't just fighting in scattered groups, they were coming together under one leader, a charismatic guy named Simon Bar Kochba. You might also hear him called Simon Bar Kochba or even Bar Kochba. Bar Kochba wasn't just seen as a military leader either. A lot of people genuinely believed he was the Messiah, the one who would finally bring victory and freedom to the Jewish people after all their struggles. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The revolt didn't start off as a losing battle. In fact, it was surprisingly successful at first. The Jewish forces were so effective that they might have even wiped out an entire Roman legion. And for a brief moment, they may have actually regained control of Jerusalem. It was a big deal because it wasn't just about fighting back. They were holding large portions of ancient Judea. But, as we all know, Rome wasn't going to just sit back and let that happen. The Romans regrouped and switched up their strategy. They went all in with brutal scorched earth tactics, completely devastating the land and the people. By the time the dust settled, Judea was shattered. The population was either killed, enslaved, or exiled, and any hope of Jewish independence was crushed for centuries to come, all the way until the modern era when Israel was established in 1948. One big challenge when it comes to studying this revolt is that we don't have a lot of surviving historical records about it. Unlike the first revolt, where we had Josephus Flavius writing things down, there's no detailed chronicle for the Bar Kochba Revolt. Most of what we know comes from a few brief mentions in works by Roman historian Cassius Dio and church historians like Eusebius and Jerome. Jewish sources from the time mostly come from rabbinical literature, and while some of it sounds pretty legendary, it still gives us a sense of how huge this event was for the Jewish community. On top of that, there have been some pretty incredible archaeological finds that help piece the story together. Coins minted during the brief period of Jewish independence show that they were, for a short time, operating as an independent state. And in the 1960s, archaeologists discovered a cave in the Judean desert known as the Cave of Letters. Inside, they found documents, including letters written by Bar Kochba himself. And now let's dive deeper into Simon Bar Kochba, the man who led the Jewish people in their last stand against the Roman Empire. He's one of the most important yet mysterious figures in Jewish history, and there's still a lot we don't know about him. What's really interesting is that Bar Kochba's name itself is a bit of a puzzle. Bar Kochba wasn't his real name. It's actually an Aramaic title that means son of a star, which gives off a pretty clear messianic vibe. Some people believed he was the long-awaited savior, the Messiah who would lead the Jews to victory. However, in other Jewish sources, he's called Shimon ben Kochba. The difference in names is actually pretty telling. In some texts, especially rabbinical ones, he's referred to as Ben Kochba, a name that's twisted into a word meaning falsehood or deceiver. This gives us a glimpse into how divided people were about him, especially after things went south. One of the most famous mentions of Bar Kochba in Jewish literature comes from the respected Rabbi Akiva. He actually believed Bar Kochba was the Messiah. He even said, "He is the King Messiah," quoting a biblical prophecy that talks about a star coming from Jacob. But not everyone was on board with this idea. Another rabbi, with some sharp sarcasm, basically said, "Well, grass will be growing on your grave before the real Messiah ever shows up." So, while there was a strong belief that Bar Kochba might be the one, not everyone was convinced. Now, when we look at how the Romans saw him, it's not too surprising that they painted a much darker picture. Eusebius, a historian of the early Christian church, describes Bar Kochba as this violent, almost tyrannical leader who claimed to be a divine figure coming from the stars. Eusebius didn't hold back in criticizing him, possibly because Bar Kochba's messianic claims clashed with the growing Christian belief in Jesus. He also accuses Bar Kochba of oppressing the Christians living in Judea, which added to his bad reputation in Roman and Christian texts. But here's the thing. Bar Kochba wasn't just about messianic claims. One of the letters discovered in the Judean desert actually calls him Nasi Yisrael, or Prince of Israel. This suggests that Bar Kochba didn't just see himself as a military leader, he believed he had restored the Jewish kingship. For anyone claiming to be the Messiah, re-establishing the kingdom of Israel was a pretty big deal. As with any controversial figure, Bar Kochba's legacy is complicated. Jewish sources, while sometimes viewing him as a brave hero, also tell stories that paint him as ruthless. There's one legend where he supposedly kicked an elderly rabbi to death for what he saw as an insult. Another story blames him for ignoring important religious advice about his soldiers, leading to his army's downfall. Some accounts even go as far as to say the rabbis were responsible for assassinating him, but that's likely just a legend. When you strip away the myths, what we're left with is a picture of a tough, charismatic, and determined leader. He truly believed he was destined to free his people, and he led them with an iron fist. But his failure to actually deliver on those promises ended in catastrophe, and it's why history often remembers him as a false messiah. Now, let's shift to the causes of the revolt. Why did it all kick off in the first place? One of the main reasons seems to be Emperor Hadrian's decision to rebuild Jerusalem, but not as a Jewish city. He planned to turn it into a Roman colony with a temple dedicated to Jupiter, right on the site of the old Jewish temple. That was a huge blow for the Jewish people, both politically and religiously. Some sources suggest that Hadrian also tried to ban important Jewish customs, like circumcision, which added more fuel to the fire. Plus, there was growing tension because of the influx of Greek and Roman colonists into Judea. On top of that, there was a particularly hated Roman governor in the region, Quintus Tineius Rufus. He was known for being harsh and cruel, and he even plowed over the ruins of the Second Temple. In the Talmud, he's described as the wicked, and it's said that he ordered the execution of Rabbi Gamliel, a revered Jewish leader. All of this built up a lot of anger and resentment toward Roman rule. Unlike earlier uprisings, the Bar Kochba Revolt wasn't just a spontaneous act of rebellion, it was carefully planned. The Jewish forces stockpiled weapons, dug extensive tunnel networks for guerrilla warfare, and, for the first time, they were united under one leader. They waited strategically for the right moment, making sure that Hadrian had left the region before they struck, catching the Romans completely off guard. And the actual details we have about the uprising come mostly from the historian Cassius Dio. According to him, the Jewish rebels initially launched a guerrilla-style war against the Romans, making clever use of their underground tunnel networks. These weren't just small skirmishes. The war quickly escalated until, as Dio put it, it was as if the whole earth was in upheaval. How much territory Bar Kochba's forces actually controlled is unclear, but they definitely managed to take large parts of Judea at the height of the revolt. Some historians even debate whether Jerusalem itself was captured. There's a coin from that time that mentions the freedom of Jerusalem, but it's not certain if that meant they physically held the city or if it was more of a symbolic rallying cry. As the conflict grew more serious, Emperor Hadrian brought in his heavy hitters. He called on one of his best generals, Julius Severus, who was stationed all the way in Britain at the time. The fact that Hadrian had to send for such a high-ranking commander from so far away shows how serious the situation had become. Severus adopted a brutal, methodical approach. Rather than facing Bar Kochba's forces head-on, He started systematically destroying their strongholds, villages, and anything that could support the rebellion. According to Dio, Severus wiped out 50 key outposts and over 900 villages, killing more than 500,000 people in the process. The destruction was so total that nearly the entire region of Judea was left desolate by the end of it. The casualties from famine, disease, and fires were so great, Dio admits they were impossible to count. Other sources like the Christian scholar Jerome echo this devastation. He writes about how Jerusalem was completely obliterated and Jewish people were slaughtered in mass numbers. They were eventually expelled from the region altogether. In Jerome's account, Bar Kochba was crushed and Jerusalem was leveled to the ground. Jewish sources, meanwhile, paint an even grimmer picture. They describe Roman soldiers engaging in horrifying acts of violence, including the killing of infants by smashing them against rocks. There's a particularly shocking tale about Hadrian building a wall of corpses that stretched for miles. While some of these accounts may be exaggerated, the message is clear. The Roman response was nothing short of genocidal. The final battle took place at Beater, a fortress near Jerusalem, where Bar Kochba and his followers made their last stand. Eusebius describes how the siege dragged on until starvation and thirst finally forced the rebels to surrender. He describes Bar Kochba's death as the price he paid for his madness. Jewish texts also remember Beater's fall with deep sorrow. They talk about the massacre of men, women, and children, and how blood from the slaughter flowed all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. One heartbreaking story tells of Jewish teachers and students being wrapped in sacred Torah scrolls and burned alive. The rabbis connected the fall of Beater to some of the darkest moments in Jewish history, such as the destruction of the first and second temples. According to the Mishnah, it was on the same date, the 9th of Av, that Beater was captured, marking another tragic milestone in Jewish suffering. As for Bar Kochba himself, the exact details of his death remain unclear, but most sources agree that he likely died during the fall of Beater. His dream of leading the Jewish people to freedom and redemption came to a devastating end in that final battle. What followed the fall of Beater was arguably as horrific as the war itself. Hadrian wasn't content with just putting down the rebellion. He wanted to erase Jewish identity from the region entirely. He renamed Judea to Palestina in a deliberate attempt to sever the land from its Jewish roots. Jewish practices were banned, and many religious leaders, including Rabbi Akiva, who had supported Bar Kochba, were executed. Jerusalem was rebuilt as a pagan city, renamed Aelia Capitolina, and Jews were forbidden from even setting foot near it. In one particularly striking account, Eusebius quotes Ariston of Pella, who wrote that after the Jewish population was wiped out, the city was repopulated with foreigners, and the Roman Emperor Hadrian was honored with the city's new name, Aelia. While some Jewish communities managed to survive in places like the Galilee, the majority of the Jewish population had either been killed, died of disease, or sold into slavery. It marked the beginning of nearly 2,000 years where Jews lived outside their homeland, with centers of Jewish life shifting to places like Babylonia, where the famous Babylonian Talmud was later compiled. The Jews were now essentially a stateless people, a situation that wouldn't change until the creation of the modern state of Israel in 1948. Interestingly, the war was also a significant blow to the Roman Empire. It's been speculated that the legendary 9th Legion, the Legio IX Hispana, may have been destroyed during the revolt, as it disappears from Roman records after this period. Dio also notes that Hadrian, after the war, wrote a letter to the Senate where he skipped the usual formalities about the emperor and the legions being in good health, perhaps hinting at just how devastating the conflict had been for the Romans as well. Now, when we think about the historical memory of the Bar Kochba Revolt, it's a bit surprising how overshadowed it became compared to the first Jewish revolt of 70 CE, which ended with the destruction of the Second Temple. There's less written about Bar Kochba, and when he is remembered, it's often in a negative light. He's seen as a failed messiah who led his people into disaster. But with the rise of Zionism in the 19th and 20th centuries, Bar Kochba's story started to be reevaluated. Some viewed him as a national hero, a symbol of Jewish resistance against foreign oppression. The holiday of Lag Bomer, which once had mystical connections to the Kabbalah, was reimagined as a celebration of Bar Kochba and his revolt. However, not everyone was on board with this new heroic narrative. Some warned that romanticizing Bar Kochba could lead to repeating the same mistakes, an overly idealistic struggle that ends in catastrophe. Today, Bar Kochba remains a complex and enigmatic figure, straddling the line between hero and cautionary tale.